this video, we are going to go over the beginning of chapter 18 on evolution. Evolution is also going to be covered in the beginning of 1108. If you go to Bio 2, Majors 2, you'll go over evolution as well. But I like to have it overlap because it's an important concept, and I think you should know this chapter. So let's start off with this first section is going to talk about origin of the species and all the different scientists. Everything that you see today that is here, me, you, everything, plants, all the animals, all the stuff, is here because of evolution. All of these organisms are around current present day because of evolution. If things didn't change, I think there was a quote somewhere in the textbook talking about the Red Queen that you always have to stay running, because if you stop, you're going to get left behind. And you're not going to make it. So evolution, understanding evolution, we are going to go through all of the scientists. So more names that you have to know. Back in the day, before Christ, we had Plato. Plato was thinking about things, looking around, and, this is over 2,000 years ago. So he's looking at the animals, and all of this stuff looks fine. It looks great. I think it's been here this whole time. Nothing's ever changed. Everything's static. That's what Plato thought. Nothing changed, no change from Plato. That was 400 BC. So let's move up another 100 years, and now we're 300 BC. And some of the other Greek philosophers, Empedocles, Xenophanes, and Aristotle, they thought that maybe life did change. Maybe everything isn't always the same. All of these Greek philosophers, maybe things changed, and that maybe these things in the rock, these fossils, are evidence of the change. So they started thinking about it. This was the Greek philosophers about 300 BC. Then jump ahead by almost 2,000 years. So 1300s through Middle Ages, through about 1600s. Catholic Church comes along. Catholic Church. So I know we've all heard stories. We've all had the history lessons, but they didn't look highly on anybody who had any sort of variation from the Bible. You were a heretic if you proposed anything other than what it says in Genesis of the Roman Catholic Bible. So they were strongly opposed to the change, and you were excommunicated at best, or you were put to death at worst case scenario. So not so great on the Catholic Church, and I'm Catholic, so I can say these things. The Catholic Church has not done a whole lot of, they've done some amazing positive things, don't get me wrong, amazingly positive things, but they've also done some shady stuff too. So they're not without blame. And this year, persecuting scientists to think about evolution because it differed from the religious ideals of the time was not so cool. So it put a damper on all the scientific studies for a while, and then another couple hundred years rolled past, and now we're in the 18th century. So 1700s, we have George, and he's the Count of Buffon, and he noticed that within the same environments, like throughout the tropics, if I'm in Cuba versus I'm over in, I don't know, what do we want to say, Madagascar, sure. There are going to be different animals in different locations, even though they're the same habitat, there's similar habitat. They're in similar environments. They're both warm and tropical climates with lots of rain, but there's different animals there. Why is that? So Leclerc got us thinking about the different animals again. This is 1700s. So he's starting the ball rolling, trying to push back against, the Catholic Church's current belief back then that this is the way it is. It's written in the Bible, and that's what I say. So we're going to move on. So Leclerc started the ball rolling again, and then we had James Hutton. And so he was looking at geologists, like Lyell, and he thinks that these changes are the result of small changes over long periods of time. So um, the current thought was that whatever happened was happened relatively quickly within a short period of time. I want to say the Catholic Church at the time believed that the earth was only like a couple thousand years old, was the predominant belief at the time. So saying that there have been small changes over a very long period of time is going against this as well. So this is Hutton thinking of that we are having gradual accumulation of small changes. Here you are, Hutton. And then Lamarck. So Lamarck is the first guy to come up with, and they're all men, of course, because back in the day, that's who was educated. So Lamarck came up with this theory. So this was the original theory for how things came to be. And so it's a good one. It's called the inheritance of acquired characteristics. It's almost there. It's a good idea. So it's just like it sounds, and you inherit you acquire characteristics. What does that mean? So Lamarck's idea was that you are acquiring characteristics via use and disuse. I use this thing, so I'm changing my bodies because I'm using it, or if I don't use it, then it will undergo attrition because I don't use it. So the example was the giraffe, and the giraffe has a really long neck, right? And because it stretches its neck to reach the leaves in the tree, then it's using its neck, and that's why it makes it longer. That's why giraffes have long necks, because they acquired it within their lifetime, and this change then gets passed down to their offspring. That's not how it goes. So Lamarck's theory was inheritance of acquired characteristics. And there was another scientist that came along and was like, oh yeah, that has to be the case. And I can't remember what his name was. I'm blanking on it now. But he conducted tests on animals. And so he had cut off the tail of a rat and reproduced it with another rat that had its entire tail intact, and assumed that that acquired characteristic of the chopped off tail is going to pass on to the babies. Well, of course it doesn't pass on to the babies. That's not an inherited characteristic when you physically cut off the tail of an animal. That's not how it works. So this was a good idea in theory. It got us thinking about how that there are traits of animals, and it got us thinking about inheritance. We know that it's not quite perfect though. The inheritance of acquired characteristics is not exactly how evolution works, and we're going to get into natural selection and evolution next. The last scientist on this page is Lyell. And so he was looking at geology and thinking about geology, the laws of physics and chemistry. They don't change, right? The law of gravity is the same law of gravity that happened 2,000 years ago. It's the same law of gravity that happened a billion years ago. The law of gravity is the law of gravity. Those things have been happening throughout this time. So those are universal. They are uniformitarianism. Those principles, those guiding laws and principles of science that happened a while ago are the same things that are happening now. This is Charles Lyell, and he came up with uniformitarianism. Lamarck's inheritance of acquired characteristics. Let's talk about who really came up with the theory. So Charles Darwin gets all the credit, right? Anytime anyone thinks of evolution, it's Darwin, especially now with the memes, with the medical information and things going around right now. Darwin, but Alfred Wallace was always kind of right there with him for a little while. So both of them were naturalists. Both of them were studying animals in different locations. They both went in different places to check out the animals. Darwin gets the credit because he published first. He published with stronger evidence, and so he gets the credit first. But they both kind of were buddies back in the day, Darwin and Wallace. So what they did was they came up with, and Darwin gets the credit again, for the theory of natural selection. And so natural selection is going to have organisms within a population. Those traits are going to increase their ability to produce viable offspring. If the traits don't increase their ability to produce viable offspring, then they don't produce the offspring and they don't make it. So if they produce traits that will increase their offspring and make them more viable, they pass on those traits more than those who don't share the viable, happy, good traits, the mutations that did not help, which ultimately leads to evolution as the environment changes and favors certain traits. So here are the three tenets of natural selection: that the characteristics, those traits we're talking about, long tails, long necks, spots, whatever, those characteristics have to be inherited. It has to be something that is passed down and inherited. If I took my hair and I bleached it, if I bleached my hair, and I go and have another child after I bleach my hair, is that passing down a trait? Mm-mm. That's not something that's inheritable. So it has to be an inheritable genetic trait that passes down. So most organisms' characteristics are inherited. They have to be passed down vertically from parent to offspring. Check, got that one. All right, you're going to produce more offspring that are able to survive. So we see this in the animal kingdom, we see this in the plant kingdom all the time, this numbers game, right? That you're going to try and hedge your bets and make more offspring than you need, because you know that not all of them are gonna make it. You see this with acorns every fall from the plants that produce seeds. You see this with sea turtles and laying all those eggs and then walking away. You're running the numbers. So more offspring are produced than will be able to survive, because resources for survival are limited. There is only so much shelter to make I got my bird. There's only so much shelter to make bird nests. There's only so much food to feed yourself and your offspring. You know, there are limited resources, and only so many animals can be supported by those resources, or plants, or whatever it is, bacteria. So only certain offspring are going to survive. You make a whole bunch of them, but only a select group of that whole big number makes it, because resources are limited no matter what you are. Bacteria all the way to elephant. Resources are limited. Offspring are going to vary in regard to their characteristics. So genetic variation. We have talked about two types of reproduction: sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction was taking a carbon copy of yourself, a piece of yourself, and that breaks off, fragmentation or budding. It breaks off and it grows up into a mini me of you. It's a carbon copy of you. That's super easy. We said asexual reproduction was really easy to do. But it didn't give you the genetic diversity of sexual reproduction. So sexual reproduction, we are going to have offspring that vary in their traits, vary in regard to their characteristics, and those variations have to be inherited. Tall and short. If we're talking about the pea plants, going back to Mendel, purple and white flowers, tall pea plants and short pea plants, yellow or green, wrinkled or smooth, those are all inherited characteristics that get passed down. So all three of these are evidence to support. They are the principles of natural selection. You will need to know these three principles. There's always a test question regarding the three principles, and one of the things is not one of the principles. So know the three tenets of natural selection. One of the places that Darwin went that is famous because of him going there and the fact that they have some super cool animals there is the Galapagos. So on the Galapagos, one of the things that he was studying was finches. And so we have the finch that blew over from the mainland, the founder species, and that founder species and a couple of its, a bunch of them, a couple of males and a couple of females. It couldn't just be just one, but a couple of them blew over from the mainland and they landed on the island. Say a hurricane came through and knocked the flock all the way to the island, way off the mainland. And they made it to this island and they look around and it is like resource galore. It's Candyland. There's all sorts of plants to eat and insects to eat and all sorts of things to eat and places to shelter. And so they went and had a heyday in this new environment, and different traits were better suited for different places. So if I wanted to eat the big, thick, heavy seeds produced by that plant over on that part of the island, then eventually I'm going to make a beak that can crunch big, heavy seeds. Not because that's my end game, not because I'm going there with a purpose, because the animals that are living in that area, the birds living in that area that have this ready-made food source, the ones that can eat the ready-made food source are healthier. Healthier birds are going to reproduce more. They're going to have the ability to get to mates, and they are going to pass on those traits, the traits that made them successful, because in biology, success is only passing on your traits. So you're living in this part of the island and you have offspring, and some offspring have little beaks and some offspring have big beaks, and the big beaked offspring make it because they can eat those seeds there, while the little offspring aren't getting as much nutrition, they aren't getting as much seeds. So these guys just breed more, and this passes on to the next generation and the next generation and the next generation, and eventually you end up with this guy with the big beak, because that's what it's selected for, because of that habitat that it lived in. Not because it was like, oh, I see big nuts over there, so I need to have a bigger beak. That's not how evolution works. That's not how natural selection works. It selects for whoever survives, and they pass their genes on. So over here, maybe this one really likes a plant that has this nectar way down deep, and so it can get this sugary food source, and the better its curvier its beak is, the better it can get inside that flower and get to that nectar. Whatever it is, they branched off, and there's all this variation that occurred and was successful. And so we can see we started with the founder, and it radiated adaptive radiation into the different types of environments available to it. And over time, those traits were selected for and other traits were not selected for. They didn't pass on. And it just kept accumulating. And so changes, gradual changes over time, gave us this variation. That is natural selection. When I say variation, I mean, big beak, little beak. Mutations we talked about before, when we have, those are going to be changes in DNA. So we mentioned X-rays can cause breakups and mutations in DNA. Another type of radiation, UV radiation. If you're out in the sun, we talked about how the sun can cause thymine dimers to occur. And so you need to change those. Those are mutations, those are changes in DNA. An adaptation is going to be a heritable trait that helps an organism survive. So these birds, these guys that moved into the area that happened to have the really good seeds from the plant that were really nutritious, and I only have to eat like 2 of these seeds instead of chasing down like 50 bugs, then I can just eat 2 of these seeds with my big heavy beak. And that works for me. Having a bigger beak helps me out in this environment, where if I was trying to use that bigger beak to peck into the bark of the tree and get a teeny tiny insect, that wouldn't be as advantageous for me. So depending on the trait and the environment, that adaptation could be useful. It just depends. So different traits, the variety of different traits is variation. And variation could be caused by mutations in the DNA or new genetic variation coming in from another population. So sexual reproduction involving a mate from someplace else. How we have evidence of this, we've got evidence of this, and we have proved this theory over and over and over again, because the previous theory was acquired characteristics, right? Which was close from Lamarck, but not quite, because it's not exactly how it works. One of the ways that we know how it works, one of the bazillion studies. So we have 2 birds. This bird beak over here, you can see is smaller bird beaks. And this bird beak over here is going to have bigger beaks. And when they sampled the bird population in this environment, the average was in the middle. It wasn't one extreme or the other, it was in the middle. So here's our mean, the mean is the average, and it is in the middle of all of these different birds. Okay, so everything's fine, but of course everything does not stay the same. We said you have to be able to adapt to change or you get left behind. So a drought happens. The drought happens, and it is going to reduce the number of small seeds. So we're limiting one of the food sources. If we are reducing the plants with the small seeds, what does that do to the birds who eat the plants? their populations aren't going to be as successful when they don't have as much food, so they can't breed and they can't support as many animals, as many offspring as they were. So that trait doesn't get passed down because they're not as successful because they can't eat because the drought came along and messed with their food source. So if they're not reproducing and they're not having successful offspring, you're not going to see that trait pass through. So the drought happened in 1977. When we come back a year later in 78, this population is now skewed towards the bigger beak birds. We can see this is lower, and over here we have higher numbers starting in the mean and going over towards the heavier end, simply because nature happened and change happened. And if you are not ready, if you don't have a variety of traits in your population, everybody is asexual and everybody has the same genes, the entire population can get wiped out. So genetic diversity from sexual reproduction is key. It is key. So this is more evidence to support natural selection. All right, so the textbook goes off on a tangent, talking about what a field biologist can do. And it has a picture of a biologist, and this is a polar bear biologist out in the field. When you say out in the field, you're out, and it may actually be in a field. Maybe it's in a rainforest, maybe it's in a creek. Who knows, but you are outside sampling whatever it is that you are studying. So with my field, I am a wildlife biologist. That's what my undergrad and master's degree is in wildlife biology. So I took classes for all the stuff, herpetology and ornithology and mammalogy. I took all of those at Auburn because they offered those. They offer those at UGA too, by the way. So I'm wildlife, and being outside and being with animals like makes me happy. That's why I'm rehabbing a bird right now as we speak. I like being out there, and I happen to like what I do professionally. So what you can do as a biologist is huge. You can do so many things. You can go out in the field and be a field biologist. You can go work at the zoo. You can go work at Georgia Aquarium. You can become a marine biologist. You can go and study plants and be a botanist. You could be a microbiologist and study the effects of drugs on E. coli and maybe come up with the next antibiotic that helps people. Biology is huge. There is a huge amount of variation. It is a very broad subject. So if you are an undergrad, I would say keep your bachelor's in biology because it is very broad. And then if you want to get an advanced degree like a master's or a PhD, get that in your specialty, marine biology, or whatever it is that you want to go on next. But stay broad as your base and then move up. So I put in some things that I did in my past life. So when I was a sophomore, my parents moved from Mobile, Alabama to Montana. And because my little brother had also graduated high school, so they were empty nesters and they left us. So I was in Auburn and my brother was in Mississippi at Southern Miss, and my parents moved to Montana. And that summer I came to stay with them, and I wanted a job because, you know, money's good. So I worked as a telemarketer, and that job was terrible. Terrible. But I also got to volunteer doing what I loved. So I loved volunteering for Parks and Wildlife out there. I got to work with Parks and Wildlife, and then I got to work with the Forest Service too. So I got to work with 2 different government agencies for the state. And one of those was I got to work with the grizzly bear and the black bear biologists that were running that area around Glacier National Park and the surrounding area in the Flathead Valley where my parents lived. So I got to trap bears during the day. It was amazingly cool. I loved it. One of the best non-jobs I have had. Loved every second of it. Long days, hard work, so much fun. So we trapped bears, and we trapped problem bears, the ones that were raiding campsites, going into people's homes, eating their garbage or the dog food or the bird food that they left outside. We didn't want bears associating people with food because that's bad. A fed bear is a dead bear. So what we did was called grizzly bear management, and it was using aversive conditioning. So instead of how you train your dog with positive reinforcement and they sit and you give them a treat and say good dog and love on them, we're doing the opposite. When they do a behavior that we don't want, like raiding a campsite, coming into somebody's house and trying to see what's in their pantry, we're going to treat that as a negative behavior, and we're going to reinforce that with negative things. So with aversive conditioning, We capture the bear on site where it's doing this bad behavior, and we drug it, and we take data. How much does it weigh? What does it look like? How's its teeth pattern? What is its claws? All the stuff. Does it look like it has offspring? If it's so, then we need to capture that offspring too. So we will drug it, take data collection, and then we will have a negative event happen. So these guys are Karelian bear dogs, and they are bred in Russia for fighting bears back in the day. And so we use them now to go after the bears, annoy the bears. They don't actually attack the bears. They could, but they usually just bark at the bears and chase them and scare them. So when that bear wakes up in its hangover state from being in this location around people, we want it to be a negative, nasty experience so they never come back here. Because if they keep doing this, they get put to bed. They get euthanized. So they wake up, they get let out of the cage on site. So here's their culvert trap. We have big ones for grizzlies and smaller ones for black bears. And they get let out of the culvert trap. Everybody's there. And you know, screaming at the bear, and it's just miserable for the bear. He's miserable, and he wants to just get away, and that's what we want. We want him to get away and never come back. So he gets yelled at. The dogs are barking. He gets shot with rubber bullets. So rubber bullets are coming at this bear. Bean bags are coming at this bear. It is not a fun experience. And so the hope is that this bear will never ever come back to this location ever again, and it will finally get its act together and go stay in the woods and don't go around people anymore. So this is aversive conditioning, which is something I got to do. I didn't get paid one dime for this. I did get paid for travel to get there and back, but this is something that you could do. You could be a bear biologist out in Montana, or you could be a bear biologist in the Smokies, which is only 3.5 hours away. The picture behind me is from Glacier, by the way. This is from Glacier National Park. So you could be a bear biologist, or you could go into veterinary school. Maybe your biology degree, and then you're going to maybe go into vet school. That's what I did for my master's, was on cats. Not quite as exciting as bears, but we did feral cat studies because feral cat management was coming on the scene, and there was this new brand called Trap Neuter Return. And so it was not very well known. It was kind of new, and we wanted to know, does Trap Neuter Return work? Because traditionally, animal control gets called to a site. They pick up all the cats that they can pick up in these traps. They trap all the cats, and they take them away, and they euthanize them because feral cats they don't adopt well. They don't want anything to do with you. That's why they're feral. So that was a traditional treatment. I wanted to see, does TNR work? So with Trap Neuter Return, we would capture the cats. We would give them all the meds, so they would get vaccinations, so they're a safe population. They get vaccinations, they have spayed or neutered, and we tip their ear. So any cat that you have seen with a tipped ear, if you see any out and about, because TNR has kind of grown since then. This was in 2003. A tipped ear means that cat has been spayed or neutered. It's like the universal sign. So we did a 1 year before and 1 year after, and I would track these cats and see if we neutered them, does their home range shrink, especially on the males, because the males are roaming, and it did. So we tried to see, does TNR work 1 year before and 1 year after? That was my master's thesis. And it turns out that it worked on half the colonies, and the other half of the colonies, it didn't have a significant difference. But I would track these cats. They would have collars on them that I would track with radio telemetry, which is the same stuff that we used for the grizzly bears back in the day, because at that time, this was 2003, GPS was not small. You could not put a GPS collar on a cat, but you could put a radio telemetry collar on a cat. They were about this big, with a little chunk about this big that dangled off, and that was the radio telemetry part of the collar. Now GPS collars are small, and you could do that, and I wouldn't have to go out there and physically track them with a radio antenna like this. So I was the crazy cat lady on Auburn's campus with a radio antenna every 3 days, tracking cats for 2 solid years. You could do this. For when we tracked the grizzly bears, we would do this by plane. So we would go up in a plane that has these antennas on the wings, and we would track the grizzly bears that way. Now, of course, you can track with satellites, but sometimes they're still using radio telemetry. So there's all sorts, again, all sorts of things that you can do as a biologist. It doesn't have to be animals. It could be plants. It could be microbiology. But biology is huge. It's a huge field. I love it. It's my favorite, obviously. Um, so let's finish off. I've gone on my tangent, and now we're going to come back to the rest of the content. Okay, how do we know about traits and following the traits and trying to do phylogenetic trees and stuff like that? So let's talk about pathways. So we have traits, and those traits could be homologous or analogous. Um, Inheritance could be convergent about a trait, or it could be divergent. That book and that movie series came out a while back where, you know, it could diverge away from something, or something comes back and it converges. So depending on what's going on, you might see convergence happening with traits, or it may be a divergence happening on the traits. Traits could be homologous, and homo means the same. Remember, homo and hetero, homo was the same and hetero was different. Homologous means that everything is the same on the structure. That means that the common ancestor had to have the same structure. So if everybody has arms, for example, we're going to get there, then it is homo, it means the same. Analogous is going to be different. All right, so what do we mean when we mean convergent? Again, convergence where stuff comes together. So we have this trait, and it happens to be the same trait, but it happens in different areas. So these are two different species. We have a sugar glider, and sugar gliders, I don't know if you see them in the pet stores because we don't have them here. They are a marsupial, so we don't have these in North America at all. You're going to see sugar gliders over Australia. Area over there is where the marsupials are. We only have one type of marsupial, and that's the possum. But anyway, we have sugar gliders, and sugar gliders, they do just like they sound. They live in the trees, and they will glide branch to branch. And to do that, they have this flap underneath their arm that connects from the top limb to their bottom limb, and it helps them glide from tree to tree. So it's something that they have evolved over time. These are sugar gliders. They are marsupial, and they evolved this gliding flap to get from tree branch to tree branch. We also have a mammal that does this. It is the flying squirrel. I don't know if y'all have ever seen a flying squirrel. They come out at night. They are super cute with their big old eyes because they're at night. They look a lot like the sugar gliders, but they're different. They grew up in different continents, but they evolved this skin flap. So this trait happened in two different originating areas, but they evolved the same trait. That's convergent. So they have a similar phenotype. They got big buggy eyes. They got the skin flap. Both of these kind of look the same. So these traits are considered convergent. They came up with the same similar looking traits, but they evolved separately, if that makes sense. They, marsupials and placentals, our flying squirrels and our sugar gliders did not buddy up together. They evolved this separately. Fossils are more proof of evolution. The fossil record, it's undeniable. You got a giant dinosaur and you look out and there's no dinosaurs roaming around now. Where did it come from? This is more proof that evolution happened. All right, so homologous and analogous. We had convergent and divergent. Homologous and analogous. Homo meant the same, right? And analogous was different. So homologous, every one of these, us, the dog that I got two of them running around here somewhere, the bird that I just put back in its crate, and the whale swimming out in the ocean, we're all tetrapods. We know we're all tetrapods. And why do we know we're all tetrapods? Because we have homologous structures. Tetrapods mean you have 4 limbs, and our 4 limbs we're all going to have a humerus, and we're all going to have a radius, and we're all going to have an ulna, and we've got our carpals and metacarpals, tarsals and metatarsals. We have these same bones set up. If you're a person, and if you are a dog, and if you are a bird, and if you are a whale, same bones. They look a little different, but they're the same bones. So that tells us that there was a common ancestor linking all of these together. So there was some tetrapod, it was probably an amphibian, coming out of the water, was one of the first tetrapods out there, and then all of us evolved from that tetrapod into the organisms that we see today. Homologous is going to be a structure that all the animals have that came from the common ancestor. Analogous, well, let's talk about the rest of the pictures over here. If you look at this, we have, this is us. This is our embryo. This is what we look like. So we look very much alien-esque at 6 weeks. If you look at a chicken embryo, I mean, look at the two pictures. They look really similar. We are both tetrapods. We're both chordates. We're both vertebrates. So we have a lot of the same structures at this point in time, humans and chickens. And you know now, I mean, if I got my bird and I put my bird on my shoulder again, we're totally different. But we still have some same basic structures that came from the same common ancestor. Those are homologous structures that came from the common ancestor. Analogous structures did not come from the common ancestor. So we have an Arctic fox who's hiding out here with his camouflage white, who helps him, camouflage in the snow, and his prey doesn't see him coming. And then we have the ptarmigan, this guy, also white, trying to blend in with the snow, so the predators don't see him and he can survive another day. So both of these evolved white. The common ancestor of the Arctic fox and the common ancestor of the ptarmigan isn't white. The common ancestor isn't white. So this is an analogous trait that evolved separately. So this is analogous. This would be an example of convergent evolution because it's the same trait, but it's not coming from the common ancestor. So it is an analogous feature, like white coats. All right. Biogeography is where we've got Pangea, and this is where everything was covered in the ocean, right? And then the landmass, the giant landmass that we all learned about is Pangea, and Pangea eventually spreads apart, and then we end up with Laurasia and Gondwanaland, and then those split apart, and then eventually we end up with the continents that we've got now. But because of biogeography, organisms that evolved when we were initially together, we can see as the continents split apart, we're still going to find those things here and here because they were originally here together. So we can see that on some different organisms out there. So here we've got an example of this type of plant. They're Proteaceae, and they are all over here and here and here and here. And it's because that all of this was together. And so that's where it developed. That's where it grew up. And then even as Pangea split apart, those guys still originated together. So there's no way it started here and somehow got over the ocean and somehow got over the ocean to here. That would be crazy. But knowing that all of it was together is biogeography, and that it eventually is split. Molecular biology, because all the life that we've got from, bacteria and archaea to humans to the plants outside my window, all of that has DNA. So that tells us that the LUCA, the last universal common ancestor, has DNA. So everything has DNA. How much of the DNA is the same between us all, that's the difference. And so if you compare human genetic information versus chimps' genetic information, we're so much alike. We're so much alike. Literally less than 2% change between us and chimps. So very much close. Humans and mice, still pretty close. 97.5% the same. And I can't remember the percentage for yeast. I used to know it off the top of my head, but I want to say it's like 30% or maybe even higher than that, that we have the same genes as yeast that are, helping us grow our bread and that are part of our microbiome. So DNA is the universal genetic information. Everything that's alive and living has. Viruses, we said, are not alive, so they have DNA or RNA. But everything that's technically alive, it's all got DNA in its core. Misconceptions of evolution is going to be the last part of this topic. So misconceptions that evolution it's just a theory. Um, well, a theory means that it's something that's been tested and tested over and over again. Again, when I talked to you on day one about chapter one and why I love science so much, is that science is something that you can prove or disprove. If somebody else says that I turned, lead into gold, I don't believe you. Show me and tell me exactly how you did it so I can do it. And then if I can do it and somebody else comes along and they're like, nope, I call BS. I'm going to try and recreate your thing. If we do this over and over again and everything keeps coming to the same conclusion, we got to say that that's really happening. And of course, we're not turning, lead into gold. We'd all be rich and that'd be super awesome. But it's not just a theory. It is the theory that we all agree on. Like 99% or 97%, something like that. All scientists agree that this is happening. So this is the current time right now, 2020. We believe that this is the theory. If we were back in the 1800s with Lamarck, maybe we would believe in inheritance of acquired characteristics. But natural selection is where it's at in 2020. That is the theory of the day. Do individuals evolve? Do they? Do giraffes' necks change because they used them or didn't use them? If I sit on my butt for a month because we're in a shelter in place and I'm not using my legs a whole lot, are my legs going to disappear? No. No, they may atrophy a little bit because I'm not using my muscles as much, but they're not going to go anywhere. My genes are my genes are my genes, and they're going to get passed down regardless. My genes don't change with me. It's not myself, my individual that's evolving. What passes down through the population changes. So what my kids get and what their kids get, and they are successful to pass on to their kids. That is how this works. It's not individuals evolving, it's populations that evolve. Does evolution explain the origin of life? Nope. Nope. That is panspermia or other theories out there, but that's not the theory of natural selection. Is not talking about the origin of how it all came to be. It's talking about the changes over time on populations. So, not origin of life. Do things evolve on purpose? We said no. That bird is not going to say, oh, look at that tree over there with all that yummy, delicious food. I'm going to grow a bigger beak. That's not how it works. The ones who have the traits that allow them to be successful, to find the mates, to reproduce and have those offspring live and survive, those traits are the successful traits, whether it is a big beak or a little beak or a long neck or a short neck, whatever that trait is that allows you to be successful and survive and pass on your genes, because that is the only end game in biology. That's what makes you successful. So you're not evolving on purpose. It is seriously survival of the fittest. Is it controversial? No, no. Again, like 97% of us don't think it's controversial. We all pretty much agree that it's controversial, that it is happening, and it's not controversial. Other theories should be taught. There's really no other theory unless you want to go back to Lamarck and his acquired characteristics. That's the only other theory out there. If we wanted to talk about the existence of God and what's taught in religion class, that is something that we can't study scientifically. So when we said that we talked about how we can come up with a hypothesis, that it has to be testable, right? You have to be able to prove or disprove. How do I prove God exists? How do I disprove God exists? So science can't really test that. And if we can't test it, then we can't have a theory about it. Does that mean that all scientists don't believe in God? No, it's not black and white like that. I do, and most of the people I know do. It's again, it's not a one or the other. It's both. It's both. So even Pope Francis, who I love, by the way, I think he's awesome. Even Pope Francis agrees that evolution and change happens, and I think he was quoted as saying that God is not a wizard. So these are the misconceptions about evolution. There are websites out there But just so y'all know, and y'all can explain to others about how evolution works, about how natural selection works, and talk about the misconceptions. That should cover, yep, the end of this section. And we'll get through the other videos later.